Welcome, welcome. We just talked about authentication. Before that, we talked about hosting and databases. Now we're going to talk about file storage. File storage is pretty straightforward. It's essentially a flowchart. You figure out what type of data you need to store. Do you need to do any post-processing, anything like that? And then you choose a storage provider. So if you're interested, let's get started. All right, so file storage. What type of data do you need to store? You got to ask yourself this question. Before you choose a storage provider and a storage method, you want to ask yourself, am I storing images, videos, binary files, documents, right? You might be storing PDFs. That's very common, PDFs or docx or something. Or maybe images. Again, another very common thing to store on the internet. You might have seen some images floating about, or videos. Like where you're watching this, are you going to be storing videos? Or maybe you have big data, Parquet files full of millions of rows and hundreds of columns or something like that. So determine what you're going to be storing first. But before you choose a provider, there are a couple more questions you need to answer. First, do you need post-processing? Post-processing means, let's say you upload an image and it's huge. You just took an image with your iPhone and it's, 5,000 by 3,000 pixels. Well, maybe you want to shrink it, right? Because if you have a list of images, you don't want to be loading all those images at full resolution. You want to load them at tiny resolution because they're tiny. So you can reduce the size, compress them, shrink them, and then they will load mega fast. So post-processing allows you to upload an image. So the service may have post-processing. You upload an image and it slices and dices it for you, compresses it, and you don't have to think about it. It just happens for you. It just happens, right? So assuming you do, there are some services that focus specifically on post-processing of files, both video and images. If you do want to host images, I recommend using an image hosting service. And honestly, it's kind of like it's cottage industry that grew out of people needing to host their images somewhere. It used to be that back in the day, you'd have your S3 bucket and you would throw everything in there and then you write your own code to cut up your images or compress them. But nowadays, you have these services that provide you in some cases, Cloudinary, ImageX, TwigPix. These are services that provide good stuff for you to be able to handle your images. Now, besides post-processing, they also give you other things like your images are hosted all over the world. So someone from India loading an image hosted in Europe, it would take longer if that image was hosted in India, right? Because it's right there, right next door. So those are called CDNs. But anyway, the point is some of these services give you a lot more than just an S3 bucket. So if you do need post-processing, you could use an image hosting service, and some of these also support videos, so something to look into. If you do not need post-processing, you could just host it in a blob storage or file storage type of bucket. I mentioned S3 earlier. These are some of the options. These are basically all going to be the same. These first three, AWS, Azure Blob, and Google Cloud Storage, all have SDKs that have been around forever, and they allow you to upload files. That's it. You just upload a file. You store it somewhere on the cloud. It's kind of like your OneDrive or your Google Drive or Dropbox or something. You just upload your files and then they sit there. Now, AWS, all of these services also have other ways to store files, but these are probably going to be the ones that you're going to be using, especially if you have something that you need to access often, meaning the storage is hot instead of cold. Like cold storage, it's kind of what you can imagine what cold storage is, right? It's something you freeze something in there. Whereas hot storage is something that you're able to access quickly, and it's available to you whenever you need it. You don't need to wait for it to come back to life or something, right? So hot storage, these are all hot storage services, but AWS, Backblaze, these also, and Azure and so on, they also have cold storage options. If you need to store files for like a long time, like years, and you don't need to access them frequently, that's something you can also consider. But these services will allow you to store files, but they won't give you any kind of extra stuff on top of that. The only exception to what I just said is Google Cloud Storage if you use Firebase, because you can actually use the Firebase SDK to upload a file. That file is stored in Google Cloud Storage, but Firebase gives you some control. You could do some post-processing on, especially on images that you upload. They use a serverless function to detect that something was uploaded and then do some post-processing on it. So it's kind of cool, and it's cheap actually. In fact, it's almost free. So Google has that. But other than that, like I'm not sure if the other providers do, but basically these are just for like if you don't need post-processing, if you're just uploading binaries or big files, you can store it in any one of these. They're all gonna cost approximately the same. In some cases, some of these are gonna be cheaper. So for example, Backblaze has a really good plan for storing files compared to like an S3 bucket. It's not as, I would say it's not as friendly to use as some of these other options. But if cost is an issue, you do want to do your research. I didn't put the costs here because it would take way too much space. But you can do that research yourself. So it's something to consider. Here are some options. I'll have an image in the description of the video, everything that you see here. One last thing I wanted to touch on here is that if you have big data, which we kind of discussed here briefly, but if you have big data, there are specific, I mean, you could store those Parquet files in Azure Blob. And in fact, you probably will if you're using Azure Databricks. If you're using BigQuery, you will be storing them in storage. But there's the extra layer on top of actually storing the file. You're also using one of these storage services to store your data. So it's no longer like raw file storage, which we discussed earlier. But I just want you to be aware that there are additional steps that you're gonna need to take if your app is gonna have any kind of big data, if you're gonna be doing any kind of processing or anything like that. And these services are not cheap. They are not cheap. Let's just put it that way. So, I mean, they start out like okay, but it's a lot of compute. These are pretty powerful platforms. Redshift and Databricks, which I have experience with, they're pretty powerful. They're not cheap, but just something to consider, right? So that's file storage. I mean, it's fairly straightforward. First, what do you need to store? One of these. Second, do you need post-processing? You go in here. Images, videos, you can use one of these. Binaries, binary and documents, you can use one of these. And for big data, you're gonna use probably one of these three, and then you're gonna use one of these three on top of that, right? So Azure and Azure, AWS and Amazon, Google and Google. That's what that looks like for file storage. Thanks for watching. And we're gonna have a couple more videos coming up. One is gonna be about logging, so that's gonna be next. So stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.